Hello, everyone. This is Dory Clark, and we're here with our weekly interview show for Newsweek Better, where we are talking about contemporary diversity issues. And we're here this week with the author, Ozan Varol. He is the author of the new book, Awaken Your Genius. His previous book is called Think Like a Rocket Scientist. And we're going to be talking today about a different kind of diversity, which is diversity of perspectives. That's something that often is lacking in contemporary society. So it's important to dive into. Ozan, it's so nice to have you here.
So nice to see you, Dory. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. So, all right, my very first question. Early in the book, one of the things that you mentioned, and I've heard this before, but I feel like this is in many cases emblematic of the problem that we're dealing with. You talk about studies that have shown that when they poll teachers, the creative students are actually oftentimes the ones that teachers like the least. Can you discuss, and what are we in the professional world to take from this data?
Yeah, I mean, the education systems, unfortunately, are structured in a way to reward compliance and reward conformity. We're taught that the answers have been determined by someone far smarter than us. And our only job in the education system is to just memorize those answers and then spit them back out on a standardized test somewhere. So that's why creative students, students who think differently, students who don't want to just memorize answers, students who pursue their own curiosity, students who raise their hand and ask a question that hasn't been asked before are often rated as troublemakers in the classroom, and they don't do very well in the education system because of that. So then when we grow up, the authority figure changes from a teacher to a manager, but unfortunately, in most environments, the mindset is the same. The manager demands conformity and compliance. The employee conforms, and so then you end up with an institution that's stuck in groupthink and that's stuck with the status quo.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's such a valuable observation. So, one of the interesting things about your background, how in fact you came to write a book called "Think Like a Rocket Scientist." Appropriately enough, you were one. You also were, got a law degree. You were a law professor. Now you are writing and speaking. So, a thing that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting in your book, I'll even read the quote. You said, the fewer labels that follow I am, the statement, I am, whatever, whatever, the more freedom you have to step into who you are. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you mean by it?
Sure. Identity often gets in the way. So we tend to equate identity with the self, but often identity actually obscures the self. And so when we think of ourselves, and you hear this stuff all the time, right? I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I am vegan, I am paleo, I'm a CrossFitter, I'm a Pelotoner. If your identity, if your beliefs are really tightly wound up in your identity, it's going to be really hard for you to change your mind, because changing your mind in that instance means changing your identity, which is a hard sell for a lot of people. And so the looser we are with our attachment to those labels, the freer we are to change our own minds and to step into who we are becoming. And so in many cases, identity actually gets in the way of growth and transformation. It also gets in the way of connection, because when you're interacting with someone who has a different identity than you do, and you're so tightly wound in your identity that you're stuck in that world and you can't see any other perspectives, it becomes really hard to build empathy and really hard to build connection.
That's really interesting. So how does that play out in the workplace? Like if you are a leader or an employee that's like, all right, I've bought in, Ozan, that sounds like a good plan. How do I, sort of keep my identity at bay in some way and separate it from my beliefs? What are some of the ways that we could actually do that and put that into operation?
Sure. I think one way is to actively seek dissent, which most business leaders don't do. So, actively seeking dissent and not expecting that people are automatically going to raise their hands and share a disagreement with you. Especially if you're a leader, I think people forget how hard it is for a team member whose livelihood depends on you in many ways, because you're making the promotion decisions, you're making the hiring decisions. How hard is for that person to raise their hand and say, hey, you know what? I disagree with what you just said, or I disagree with the strategy you're about to implement. And so being able to tap into disagreements and dissent becomes really, really important because, you're a brilliant person, but you're not as brilliant as 10 or 20 people combined. And so being able to tap into the creative potential of your employees becomes really, really important. The example that popped to mind is from a completely different field. Mike Nichols, who was a film director, he directed classics like The Graduate, and he was Meryl Streep's favorite film director to work with because he was not tied to his identity. He was not tied to his own ideas, and he would accept feedback from anyone on the set. And one of the things that he would do, they would film a take, and he'd cut, and then he would say to everyone on the set, "What is the dead whale here?" In other words, what is the thing that's underneath the scene that's stinking up the whole room that no one is talking about? And he would lean in and he would listen and he would accept feedback from anybody on the set. And I think that mindset of, I might be wrong, and I'm going to actively go to my team members to seek dissenting opinions becomes a really important tool for creating a more innovative and more creative workplace.
That's a great point. We're here with Ozan Varol. He's the author of the new book, Awaken Your Genius. This is Dory Clark and our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. And you can learn more about the show, sign up for regular updates at doryclark.com. Just enter your email address. And if you want to learn more about Ozan and his work, go to ozanvarol.com. So on a related topic about great leaders, Ozan, one of the features of the Newsweek Better Show is that we ask our interview guests to identify a Better Leader of the Week nominee. And the person that you have identified is a woman who works at Lululemon. Her name is Sarah Rice. Can you talk a little bit about who Sarah is and why you're nominating her?
Yeah, Sarah is a leader at Lululemon, and I've worked with her on a number of events now and observed her in action. She is an incredible force. She really has a knack for leaning into the company's core values of psychological safety, of innovation, and creating an environment where people are free to share ideas. So the type of mindset we just talked about with Mike Nichols, I've seen her generate in a corporate environment, which is really difficult to do. And she's also been in charge of a number of workshops on intellectual humility, cultural humility as well. And so I wanted to nominate her for the Better Leader of the Week award, or because she really exemplifies the qualities that a leader should embody.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. Again, the book is Awaken Your Genius. You can learn more at geniusbook.net. So, Ozan, something that I think bears digging into. We all say that it's a great thing, and I mean, in fact, research shows that diverse perspectives in at the workplace are helpful in terms of creating better teams, better outcomes. You have fewer blind spots, all of these kinds of things. But sometimes there's a cost when people are raising their hands and expressing a different opinion. And in your book, you actually share a story, which on one hand is kind of perfect because it's slightly ridiculous, but on the other hand, I can imagine that in the moment it was terrifying. Which is that you had written an article about the problem with meditation, the sort of the dark side of meditation, and apparently just got like completely trashed and hate mailed because of it. Can you talk a little bit about what happened with this situation and what lessons you extracted from it?
For sure. And let me begin by saying that I have been a long-time meditator. I've been meditating regularly for about a decade. And speaking of identity, in many ways, I'm a meditator has been a part of my identity for a very long time. So I came across this research study. I don't remember the exact figures right now, but the research study showed that a good amount of people who meditate actually experience pretty significant adverse effects from it. Like anxiety, for example, comes up. People might have panic attacks. And so when I first read the study, my identity as a meditator got in the way, and I was like, "Oh, that can't be true." And then I leaned in. I put my identity to one side. I leaned in, and it was a meta-analysis and peer-reviewed, really great research study. And so I wanted to, and I did share the study with my own audience to meditate on the dangers of thinking in these rigid categories of yes, no, right, wrong, bad, good. And this thing that I think most people assume is a universal good, meditation, is not a universal good. It has incredible effects for a lot of people, including myself, but for some portion of the population, it actually generates adverse effects. So I decided to share this with my own audience, and I got, as you said, more hate mail for that post than anything else I've written in recent memory, which, when you think about it, is sort of ironic because it's very unzen, because meditation teaches loose attachment to ideas and beliefs. And so it was ironic that I got so much hate mail from meditators. But I think, look, their response is all too human. I think we are, in many ways, we operate in these categories. We put things and people into categories, but that gets in the way of clarity. That gets in the way of humanity. That gets in the way of connection. That gets in the way of being able to see perspectives that are different than yours. It's really simple to put things and people into categories, but it's also incredibly misleading and incredibly hurtful in so many ways. I think there's just so much beauty in complexity, and that includes complexity of human beings and difference of thought as well. And being able to say that, look, there's actually multiple perspectives to this issue as opposed to only one.
Yeah, that's great, and it's certainly an ironic example, but one that I'm sure many of us have our own variations of that we can point to. So it's a great reminder. Speaking of decisions or public announcements that get a lot of blowback, one of the examples that you cite in your book as sort of a negative example, a way that maybe things shouldn't be done, is Netflix and the story of how things went down when they decided more than a decade ago now to attempt to split apart their streaming business from their DVD by mail business. Can you talk a little bit about what that's, for those who may have forgotten or who, were Gen Z at the time? Can you talk about what the situation was and what the problem was in their execution?
Yeah, you summarized it really well. So Netflix only had one service. You mailed DVDs, you streamed from the same service. They decided to split this up into two different businesses. One, the split off business was called Quickster. And Reed Hastings, who was the CEO at the time, describes the decision as, I think he called it the most humiliating mistake he's made in his career. Not only did they lose millions of subscribers, but the stock price dropped by more than 75%. So people were really angry that they now had to pay for two different services. They had to go to two different websites, and the combined payment was a lot more. And despite, and this was the underlying cultural problem at work at Netflix, despite all the talk inside the company, despite the sort of the value statements and mission statements speaking about the importance of dissent, importance of disagreement, the culture did not live up to those expectations. And disagreement and dissent wasn't tolerated. And one of the VPs who thought this was actually a bad idea didn't open up to Hastings, because he said, look, like, when you speak so confidently, so clearly, you believe so strongly in an idea, like your identity is wrapped up in what you're saying often when you speak, that I didn't feel safe speaking up. I should have laid down on the track saying this is a terrible idea, but instead he kept quiet and didn't share dissent, and this catastrophe ensued. And there's so many examples like this. And so it becomes, as a result, so important to create an environment where people do feel free to speak up, do feel psychologically safe to raise their hands and share an opinion and illuminate what's in your blind spot, because there's just no way for you to see what you're missing. And so Hastings now says, and I think the environment is much better inside Netflix for this to actually happen. He says, to disagree silently is disloyal. And I think if you can create a culture that actually lives up to that statement, well, you're going to have much more innovative workplace as a result.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. We're here with Ozan Varol. He's the author of the new book, Awaken Your Genius. You can learn more at geniusbook.net. Now, Ozan, something that you say in the book that I thought was interesting was that the only thing that's more dangerous than imitating other people is imitating yourself.
Mhm.
Can you talk about what you mean by that and why that is a problem?
Sure. And I'll give you an example from my own life where I tried to imitate myself and did not work. So, my last book was called Think Like a Rocket Scientist, and it was a successful book. And so, when I sat down to write my next book, what ended up being Awaken Your Genius, there was a really strong temptation to just look back at the past and to imitate what I did before. And the initial structure that I came up with, Awaken Your Genius, looked identical to the structure for Think Like a Rocket Scientist. Like the same word count, the same structure, the same 3 parts, the same 9 chapters, same everything. And something really strange happened when I then sat down to write the book. I got writer's block for the first time in my life. Like words completely stopped flowing, and trying to take this container that worked before and impose it on a completely different idea and completely different book just wasn't working for me. So I set aside the structure and I said, look, Think Like a Rocket Scientist was me 3 years ago. I'm a different person now. I'm writing a different book, and I'm not going to try to recreate the last best thing, and I'm going to step into who I am today, and actually lean into what's coming up. And so I wrote what ended up being a very different book that was much truer to who I am today than that I would have been if I just tried to imitate what I did before.
Yeah, that's a really powerful example. It's true. I mean, on one hand, it makes logical sense. Oh, this thing worked. Let's do more of that. But it can definitely become a trap. And another related area that I was interested in your book, Awaken Your Genius, one of the things that you point to, which is a little bit counterintuitive, is what you call the problem with deliberate practice. Now,
Mm.
we have heard, all the Malcolm Gladwell readers out there have heard for a long time that deliberate practice is good. That's the thing we for sure should be doing. You are pointing to some of the shortcomings of that. Why might that be a problem?
Deliberate practice is great at honing a skill that you're performing the same way over and over again. So, deliberate practice is how you perfect your golf swing, or how you get that right chord on the guitar, or how you memorize that opening move in chess, where you're repeating the same move over and over again. And deliberate practice is great for that. But what if you're playing a game where the rules aren't constant? The rules are constantly actually changing, and you're not performing the same thing over and over again. You're actually expected to perform different things. You're expected to create new ideas. You're expected to dance with uncertainty. If that is the goal, if the goal isn't execution, but the goal is creativity and generation, then deliberate practice doesn't really work, because deliberate practice is looking back at what's worked in the past and repeating it. Sort of this discussion we just had about imitating what's worked before. Um, the opposite of deliberate practice, or maybe I should say the complement to it, when the goal is idea generation, not idea execution, is deliberate play. So creating more room for play in your life. And I know, some of you who might be listening to this might be thinking like, my job is too serious to play. And I'll give you an example from a profession which is as serious as they get, which is astronauts. Now, astronauts, space flight is really risky business. Lives are at stake, and astronauts play more than any other profession, because they're operating in this unforgiving, uncertain environment of space. And so they're doing all of these simulations, which are essentially games on the ground, to be able to deal with that uncertain environment of space. And they're not simply repeating tasks, they're not simply repeating solutions to problems that they're actually going to expect, but this people in charge of running those simulations are throwing curveballs at them, giving them scenarios they've never faced before, and asking them to play, to get used to working with each other and get used to generating new ideas and new ways of looking at problems that they haven't seen before. So it's not that you can play when the stakes are low, it's that you must play when the stakes are high, because that's how you deal with uncertainty, and that's how creativity happens.
It's a really interesting perspective. We have time probably for just two more questions. Ozan, one thing I'm wondering about. So, as is the point, one of the points that you make in Awaken Your Genius, it is useful. It's important to be marshaling people's different ideas and perspectives in the workplace, in life. That is beneficial for everyone. It's also true that typically people prefer to be around other people that are like them, that think like them. There's this sort of drive toward homogeneity that is kind of hardwired into us as humans. What do we do about that? How can we actually overcome it to get to the point where we can actually seek out some of the diversity that we know is beneficial for us, perhaps both as people and in terms of business results?
Sure. I think there's a number of things you can do. Number one is just remembering and acknowledging the point that you just made, which is that we are hardwired toward conformity, and so we hire people who follow the same path that we did. We promote people who think like us. So being aware that we are hardwired to do that is step number one. Step number two is, I think, realizing and remembering that you've got nothing to learn from someone who thinks exactly as you do. So two people who think alike are like two mirrors reflecting each other to infinity. And difference and diversity isn't a problem to be fixed. It's something to lean into. It's something to learn from. And when you look at successful businesses, successful space missions, successful anything, you've got a diversity of people who don't look alike, who don't think alike, who come together to solve really interesting problems. And this is the other point. Successful groups embody uncomfortable truth-telling. I mean, there is this misconception that the best places to work are like really happy places where people just get along with each other. And that is a misconception. The best places to work, the most successful organizations, tend to be those where people are engaged and energized around solving interesting problems. But there is also uncomfortable tension there. There is awkward moments. There is hard conversations. But those elements are what make up a successful workplace, not the type of misconception one might have about a group of people who just all look happy or smiling, but no one is raising their hand and sharing dissent. No one is offering different perspectives. And so the creative genius of your team members as a result gets lost and the organizational culture suffers.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So the final question I have for you, Ozan, if someone's watching today who is a leader who has some influence over their team or organizationally, and they like what you're saying, they want to actually help awaken the genius of the employees in their organization and the people who work with and for them, what is one tip or strategy that they can employ to make their workplace be a place that actually fosters and facilitates that better?
Yeah. Leading by example is probably the most important thing. So that means in practice, telling your team members, the people that you're leading over and over again, things like, I need to hear from you because I'm likely to miss things. Or where am I wrong? Like, let's see who can poke holes in my idea. The strategy that I came up with to launch Quickster and to spin our business into two different businesses. Where am I wrong? So actively inviting dissent and sharing your own mistakes and failures. If there's a perception that the leader can do no wrong, that the leader is invincible, then it's really hard to get the truth out of people. And it's really hard to create an environment of psychological safety where people actually feel free to share their own mistakes and failures. And so lean in and say, look, I screwed up. My judgment was bad in this case. Here is why. And here is what I learned from it. And two business leaders pop to mind, Sarah Blakely, Spanx, Ed Catmull, formerly of Pixar, would both do this regularly with their employees. At all employee meetings, new employee orientations, they would share their own mistakes and failures with the group, lean into them by modeling the behavior that they want to see from the people that are working in that organization.
Really helpful. Thank you so much. We've been here with Ozan Varol. He is the author of the new book, Awaken Your Genius. This is Dory Clark and our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. You can learn more about Ozan and his work at geniusbook.net. Ozan, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Dory.
Thank you. Take care and see everyone next week.